Here he insisted it was due to hygiene he was pulling his hand away. As he crisscrossed the world, he won admiration from other like-minded, more liberal individuals. Especially of his commitment to interfaith dialogue, leading to a landmark agreement between the Catholic Church and Islamic faiths, and an unprecedented visit to Iraq. Peacemaking was at the core of his work, welcoming Ukraine's President Zelensky to the Vatican and breaking protocol to visit the Russian embassy, expressing concern over the war. In his final years, poor health meant more hospital stays and events cancelled. But even when sick, Francis wanted to show the church was more open than before. Inviting 200 comedians for a special audience, appointing the first woman to head up a Vatican department, and keeping active even in his final days, here meeting with inmates at Rome's main prison on Thursday. But despite his human approach, the clash between the traditional and the liberal remained his greatest challenge. A reformer who tried, not always successfully, to bring the church into the modern world.
Rhiannon Mills there reflecting back on the life of Pope Francis. Well, the prayers for the Pope have been particularly pronounced in one church community in Gaza. Pope Francis last spoke to its priest on Saturday night. Our correspondent, Nicole Johnston, reports now on the Pope's special links to that one Catholic church in Gaza.
It is hard to find a place of peace in Gaza in the middle of this war. But here is one. The Holy Family Church in the north of the Strip. Gaza's tiny community of Catholics attended Mass to mourn the loss of Pope Francis.
Yusuf.
A Pope who called them every day, even from hospital.
Sto bene, grazie a Dio. Mi scusa, è stato con il Santa Messa.
Ah, con la messa. E dimmi,
Sì.
cosa avete mangiato oggi?
Del pollo, le ali. Il resto dei polli, il resto del pollo, la salita.
He lifted their spirits at a time when Gazans feel abandoned by the world. Pope Francis was outspoken on the war. In a statement on Easter Sunday, he called for a ceasefire, for the release of hostages, and aid for the, quote, starving people of Gaza. He also said unarmed civilians are targets for bombs and gunfire. The last call the church leaders received from Pope Francis was on Saturday night.
More than 1 year and a half, and he called every day. He asked to us to help the people, to protect the children. So in the name of the Lord and the Church, we try to continue to give this message of peace, of justice, of protection for every human being.
Pope Francis supported Palestinians, prayed for them and urged them to be strong. He also condemned rising global anti-Semitism and called for peace between both sides.
We received the news and were in a state of great shock because the Pope was checking in on us daily. He doesn't just ask about the Christians, but about the Muslims as well. He asks about Gaza as a whole.
There was a special bond between Gaza and the Pope. These nightly calls of comfort. A connection to the world. A smile, a laugh.
Bye-bye.
Hope when all feels lost. Nicole Johnston, Sky News, Jerusalem.
Well, the Pope's death was announced by the Irish-born Cardinal Kevin Farrell, a Camerlengo of the Holy Roman Church. A Camerlengo, or Chamberlain, becomes the acting head of the Vatican until a new Pope is elected. Pope Francis visited Ireland in 2018 and talked about the Church's failings there, including on the scandal of child abuse. Our Ireland correspondent, Stephen Murphy, reports now on the country remembering the Pope and his visit.
We feel sad for the loss of our Holy Father, Pope Francis. And so we pray for his soul to rest in peace.
Around Ireland, homilies were hastily rewritten. A day to celebrate resurrection, also now a moment of stark loss.
I feel very sad on one hand because he brought so much joy to the church, but on the other hand, I am also filled with that hope that he brought, that he is safely in the hands of God. He has no more pain, no more worries, no more suffering.
Massgoers at the Bro Cathedral in Dublin reflected on the Pope's legacy.
I think he was a pope for the people, as they say, really going out there and seeing the people and listening to them.
He has left us a wonderful legacy, brought a lot of freedom to people. Very grateful for that.
The Taoiseach said the Church had lost an exceptional leader.
He will be remembered as someone who cared deeply about each individual and was particularly hurt by the wrongs that were committed by members of the Church on people, and particularly young children.
Pope Francis became only the second ever pontiff to visit Ireland in 2018. He arrived to a very different country than his predecessor, Pope John Paul II, in 1979. This visit was overshadowed by years of Catholic abuse scandals and declining church influence in Ireland. Its clear theme was forgiveness, and the Pope met with a group of abuse survivors, among them Mary Collins.
At that meeting, there was a lot of very harsh words and about what had gone on in the church in Ireland. He was actually shocked by a number of things, and he came out with an expletive at one part of it, and that hit the newspapers the next day. But he was genuinely shocked by some of the things he heard.
At an open-air mass in the Phoenix Park, Francis begged for forgiveness.
We ask for forgiveness for members of the Church who did not take charge of painful situations and remained quiet.
Taoiseach at the time, Leo Varadkar, asked the Pope to ensure victims were given justice, but feels the Church has since fallen short.
I think in terms of restitution for historical wrongs, we didn't see the level of cooperation that perhaps I would have hoped for in terms of access to records and in terms of financial contributions. But I don't think that should mar his papacy. You know, the papacy that he led and he represented, you know, made me feel somebody who was brought up Catholic but isn't a religious person, made me feel more comfortable within the church in which I was raised.
Ireland now has a complicated relationship with Catholicism, and Francis's legacy will be measured against that. A decent man who tried to atone for the most indecent crimes. Stephen Murphy, Sky News in Dublin.
Well, a quick look at the other stories of the day now. And Ukraine's President Zelensky says a delegation will hold talks in London on Wednesday with British, French and American representatives to work towards an unconditional ceasefire. President Putin says fighting has resumed in Ukraine following the 30-hour Easter truce, which both sides accused each other of breaking. In response to the Ukrainian president's call for a comprehensive 30-day ceasefire, the Russian leader accused Kyiv of trying to seize the initiative, but added, "We must think about it." The Palestinian Red Crescent has claimed the Israeli military investigation into the killing of emergency workers in Gaza is full of lies. The military probe said there were a number of professional failures, but there was no attempt to conceal the event after 15 Palestinian medics were shot dead and buried in a shallow grave last month. And the White House says President Trump stands by his Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, after reports that he shared details of an attack on Yemen last month in a second group chat that included his wife and brother. These are the same strikes that were leaked to a journalist who was accidentally included in discussions about plans for the operation. Well, let us return now to the news of the passing of Pope Francis. You can hear equipment being moved around. There's a sense of Easter concluding and what is to come. So Barbara Serra is here with me once again.
I think they're building where all the journalists are going to be, the sort of, the levels, the platforms, yes.
But a papacy is always a very political thing, is it not? And even more so with what is to come in the weeks ahead with the conclave, and whether, the big question now, whether the church will take a radically different turn from a man who was seen as a liberal, who believed in the mercy of Christ.
I mean, it does end up being a bit of a numbers game, doesn't it? About 130 cardinals that can vote in the conclave. And remember that Pope Francis actually elevated about 110 of them. So you would look at that and think, well, the conclave will be full of people who think along the lines of Pope Francis. But what's interesting is that people see him as progressive, but more than anything, I think he wanted to be inclusive. And so what he did is that it created a lot of cardinals from the global south. But that obviously means that ideologically, many of them are not necessarily progressive. So again, numbers, about a fifth of all Catholics around the world come from Africa, but a lot of African countries, in those countries, for example, homosexuality is illegal, whereas in the West, one of the things that many Catholics want to see is a papacy that is more inclusive of LGBTQ rights. So it'll be interesting to see how the conclave works. Of course, we're going to see the cardinals arrive here from all over the world, and it will be interesting. I mean, we'll never know the details, obviously, but it'll be interesting to see what factions are created, because the papacy, the Vatican, is always a little bit political. I mean, it's soft power. A lot of Catholics around the world don't really follow all the Catholic teachings, beyond the sort of sphere of religion. So it's not direct power, but it is influence. And as we both know, it comes at a time of an enormous political shift around the world, the international world order being turned upside down. So I think this conclave and the future of the papacy will be even more political than it usually is.
Barbara, thank you very much indeed. Well, that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we will take a first look at tomorrow's newspapers. That is in the press preview. Barbara will be here with me, also joined by the religious affairs correspondent of The Times, Kaya Burgess, and the religious affairs commentator, Catherine Pepinster. Back in just a moment. So discussing then how the papers are reflecting the death of the Pope. This on the front page of the Daily Mirror, their headline, The People's Pope.
significant day of this conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Tanks, heavy vehicle.
Why only in America?
People want their country to work.
Just want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first.
Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. In the next half hour then, we'll see what's making the headlines with the religious affairs correspondent of The Times, Kaya Burgess, and the religious affairs commentator, Catherine Pepinster. And here with me at the Vatican, of course, is Barbara Serra. So let's see what is on those front pages then. And the People's Pope is the headline for The Eye, which describes Francis as a charismatic champion of the poor, hailed for reforming the Catholic Church. The Daily Mirror has the same headline and says he fought all his life for the poor and the forgotten. The Daily Telegraph says one last Easter blessing and his work was done. The Daily Mail reflects on the Pope's passing, saying he's returned to the house of his father. Truly blessed is the Sun's headline, which says millions are mourning around the world. The Guardian reports the 88-year-old died of a stroke and heart failure. The Metro has an image of Pope Francis touching hands with a young girl only yesterday on his final tour of St. Peter's Square. A photo of the Pope features on the front page of the Financial Times, but the paper leads with Beijing warning it will retaliate against countries that negotiate trade deals with the US at the expense of China's interests. So we're joined tonight then by the religious affairs correspondent of The Times, Kaya Burgess, and the religious affairs commentator, Catherine Pepinster. Welcome to both of you, and Barbara, thanks for staying on as well. Kaya, why don't we kick off with you then? The front page of The Guardian, you know, reflecting on Pope Francis's life and his legacy. What have you made, first of all, of the reaction of the newspapers tonight?
It's hugely interesting, isn't it, when you have a very rare day when every single newspaper, from the Financial Times to the Sun, broadsheets, tabloids, business newspapers, they all have the same story on the front page because of what a global figure the Pope is generally, but Francis particularly, I think, captured people's interest. Quite a different Pope with a different background, a different approach, a more humble approach. The Guardian's front page is quite a sort of straight telling of today's news, but its headline describes him as a groundbreaking head of the Catholic Church. So that's sort of just showing how he was seen as a very different figure than you might necessarily have expected in the past from the pontiff.
Well, Catherine, do you agree? I mean, that word groundbreaking, was he, and if so, why?
I think he was. I think it's because he was somebody who didn't stand on ceremony. He had spent so many years before he arrived in Rome, before he was elected, working in the church in Argentina as first Archbishop and then Cardinal of Buenos Aires. He would travel by public transport, by the local bus, by their tube service, meeting people all the time. And it was apparent when he went to Rome, when he was elected as Pope, that he wanted to continue living that sort of life as much as possible. He didn't like other people carrying his suitcase. When he first was elected, he used to ring up and try and book his own flights. He just didn't want too much ceremony. He chose not to live in the Apostolic Palace. He lived in a fairly humble residence instead. And that coloured the kind of Pope he was, I think, yes.
Well, Barbara, the apartment at the Apostolic Palace was sealed today, even though he never lived there, choosing more humbly to be at St Martha's House, which is where the cardinals stay for the conclave during voting. He suggested that if he had to stay here, he'd have to see a psychiatrist. So what was it about him that was so humble and wanted to be amongst the people?
So there's a funny anecdote about that I heard years ago in Rome, that apparently senior clergy never wanted the Pope to come to their house for dinner, because then he might see the opulence that perhaps they lived in and would ask them to maybe tone it down. I think it boils down to his heritage, the fact that he grew up in Argentina, Buenos Aires. From the first, he was sort of the Pope of the poor, and it's something that you could see throughout his papacy. Let me also, while you've been looking at the UK front pages, I've been looking at some of the Italian newspapers, and it's interesting, they have some dates. Now, just to be clear, this is not confirmed by the Vatican, but most of the leading Italian papers are saying the funerals might be Saturday and the conclave after the 5th of May. So that just coming from some of the front pages, but just to, it hasn't been confirmed by the Vatican. But yes, absolutely, he was always the Pope of the poor and the people's Pope. Again, that phrase that you see on all the headlines is very much the sort of what his papacy was like.
Yes, and a picture there, Kaya, on the front page of the Daily Mail. He's returned to the House of the Father, which is the Vatican statement we had this morning. I mean, is it fair to say that after seeing him yesterday in multiple appearances, as it turns out, including with the US Vice President, that it was a shock, the news first thing this morning?
Well, some of us spoke to Cardinal Vincent Nichols, the Merseyside-born Archbishop of Westminster, this afternoon, and he said he was driving up the motorway this morning when he got a call to tell him that the Pope had passed away, and his reaction was, "You're joking," because he'd seen the pictures of him yesterday doing the blessing, meeting the US Vice President, and just never thought that, you know, within a few hours he would have passed away. And he suggested that it's not the first time a Pope has managed to sort of last just through that Easter weekend, that really key date in the Christian calendar, and that perhaps that sort of kept Pope Francis kind of going, if you like, until Easter Monday, before he passed away this morning. And he sort of made the point it was very fitting that this came just after Easter, and as if God was calling him home, was how the Cardinal put it.
And Catherine, if we take a look at the Sun, reminding us that millions are now mourning across the globe, Pope Francis did see an increase in Catholic support, did he not? He was popular amongst young people. You know, what specifically were the issues that younger Catholics backed him on?
I think they noticed how he spoke in a rather different way about how people lived. He talked constantly about God's mercy. There wasn't a sort of sense of kind of finger-wagging religious leader who was ticking people off. There was this focus on mercy, there was a focus on joy, there was a focus on hope. It was really noticed many years ago when he was first Pope, when he was asked about gay people and he said, "Who am I to judge?" That set a tone for the kind of Pope he was, I think. And a lot of people also noticed how much he talked about the environment. He talked about the planet being our common home. He wanted people to cherish God's creation and love it and treat the planet with respect and be aware of the problems it faced. And I think that resonated with a lot of young people as well. So a Pope who, though he died at a great age of 88, he did have this way of communicating with much younger people.
And Barbara, we see the Metro's front page, the final blessing. It would have meant so much to him to be able to appear on Easter Sunday. The words were not read by him, but they were his message. He talked about the war in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Myanmar, in Yemen. You know, his was a message often of peace and about those left behind. He even pointedly talked about looking after migrants, having met J.D. Vance and having earlier criticised the Trump administration for its policy of returning migrants.
It's interesting how his papacy overlapped with a lot of those issues. So, for example, he was Pope for the first Trump administration and now for the second. We were talking about climate change a little earlier. Well, in a sense, his papacy overlapped a lot of the impact of climate change becoming more tangible and, of course, the migration crisis of around 2015. So all those topics he made his, and very much, again, we go back to that point of, is he political, is he not? But he didn't hold back in a lot of other conflicts. You know, he spoke widely about the conflict in Sudan, which often doesn't get as much coverage as other conflicts. So he was very much always a Pope that almost didn't mince his Francis' words, and he absolutely did not follow the doctor's advice. He was meant to be on bed rest when he was finally, let out of the Gemelli, but we saw him here very much until the day of his death.
Yes, being told you need at least 2 months of recuperation, less than a month, and a busy schedule, certainly. A very strong page, Kaya, on the front of the Daily Mirror as well. But Barbara, picking up on some of the conflicts he talked about, extraordinarily speaking to a church in Gaza daily, including, we're told, on Saturday. What was that trying to say?
I mean, he really made it his mission to try to kind of speak to people that he saw as kind of forgotten, and that was something that he did in Rome. He set up showers for homeless people in the Vatican and employed a barber to give them haircuts. When it came to Gaza, he was very keen to keep on talking about the need for peace, to keep on talking about how war shouldn't be something that's inevitable, as something that can be ended. Obviously, that particular conflict is seen as something that is intractable and sort of almost eternal. People seem to think it's going to go on forever. He was trying to make the point that it doesn't have to go on generation after generation. And to talk to the parish priest in Gaza, who's clearly feeling, extremely cut off, as are so many people in Gaza. I think he was making that real point of showing that, despite it being somewhere that's seen as inaccessible, that's seen as cut off, that he can still kind of reach into there, even as we saw earlier, if it's by, video calls to remind them that people are thinking of them.
And Catherine, the Daily Telegraph as well, one last Easter blessing and his work was done. It just reminds us of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, who worked, almost again till the day she died. But underneath that, there is a story again about Donald Trump. Is there a sense here that a powerful liberal voice has passed away?
It's interesting that there's that almost tension on that front page, because Pope Francis met Donald Trump during the last presidency of Trump, and there clearly was some tension there. Pope Francis had very different views about how you treat migrants, how you treat the marginalised. I'm sure something of that must have come up in the conversation with Vice President Vance only yesterday, and I think there will be a lot of people feeling that a voice has been silenced, a voice of the kind that the world needs to hear. And I think for a lot of Catholics, even when they perhaps don't necessarily absolutely agree with everything a particular pope is saying, they still see him as the figurehead of their church, and they really notice it when there is no pope, when we are in a time which is called the sede vacante, the empty throne, which is what we're in now, and the church for a few days will feel really quite rudderless, and that will be something that will really strike Catholics as they await first Pope Francis' funeral, and then, of course, the conclave to elect his successor.
Yes, and we already start to see, cardinals, some of them obviously based here, milling around, talking to journalists here, others flying in from around the world, and then heads of state will. Now, what are the chances of Donald Trump coming here? Certainly we heard from Caroline Levitt, the press spokeswoman today, saying no plans are in place, but it doesn't mean it won't happen. So that was effectively the message.
It's interesting. I mean, you have to think how many funerals would attract quite that level of global attention. I mean, maybe, the Queen, when the Queen died, and so many people coming. Who knows what Donald Trump will decide to do, but certainly the eyes of the world will be on Rome for that funeral, for the Vatican. And, this is a time as well when religion is becoming itself very political, so it'll be interesting to see whether he comes or not.
Barbara, thank you very much indeed. And to our guests as well, Kaya Burgess from The Times and Catherine Pepinster, we really appreciate your thoughts there. Going to leave you with the eye as well, which possibly sums up Pope Francis, the headline for the paper, the People's Pope, smiling amidst the crowds. That is where he wanted to be. And his final wishes make clear he wants a humble, ending for his extraordinary life as well. The Eye saying he was charismatic, a champion of the poor, and hailed for reforming the Catholic Church. Our coverage, of course, continues. Matt Barbette has Sky News at 11.
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before? Yes. Cheers.
We'll start with breaking news.
Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
Day of this conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Tanks, heavy vehicle. Why only in America? People want their country to work.
You want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first.
This is Sky News at 11 o'clock. I'm Matt Barbette. The headlines this evening. Pope Francis has died at the age of 88. After months of illness, his death was sudden from a stroke and heart failure, says the Vatican. The shock for the devoted, losing their figurehead just hours after he was seen greeting crowds in St. Peter's Square. Tonight, the faithful have been gathered